most biggest dangers that many people face in recovery, and it's felt in a special way right now with COVID-19, and that's the danger of loneliness. And because of this self-imposed isolation, you're in a situation that is conducive to increasing your feelings of loneliness. And so I want to talk about that, knowing how dangerous it can be. So let's begin again by just talking about loneliness definition, trying to understand what we mean by using that word. Technically, it's a word that is used to describe a social pain. And so the definition is a psychological mechanism designed to motivate people to seek social connections. In other words, something's built into us that if we're alone for too long, we start to feel uncomfortable, we start to feel dissatisfied, we even start to feel pain. And that pain is designed to motivate us to seek out healthy connections. So loneliness, by definition, is a painful thing that was designed to be a good thing that pushed us towards healthy connection. Now, there's a couple qualifiers that I need to give to that. Loneliness is not about the lack of people in your life. What it is about the lack of ability to connect to people in your life, especially to healthy people. So loneliness is not so much about the number of people, it's about your connection ability. Secondly, and just as important, is it's not just about the lack of connection with other people, it's about not being able to connect with yourself. So a truly lonely person can't connect with themselves. That then influences how they approach relationships with others so that they don't connect with others, and therefore they feel lonely. Now, let me make a little distinction for you, but an important one. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Being alone can result in feeling lonely, but many people who are alone don't feel loneliness because they connect well with themselves. And they know that they can be alone for a period of time, but then they need to connect with others. And so for them, being alone isn't being lonely. But for people from complex trauma, they are lonely to begin with, and then being alone just exacerbates that feeling of loneliness that's deep inside of them. I found it very interesting in doing some research over the last couple of weeks on loneliness that a study showed that about 45% of Canadians feel lonely on a regular basis. Now, I don't know if that means that they feel very connected most of the time and they get the odd little wave of loneliness, or my assumption would be that they are people who the majority of time, even when they're around people, still feel lonely. So that's almost half of our population that struggles with loneliness. And that is, to me, a very scary statistic. But I would say, from what I have seen, I think there's some truth in that statistic. Let me show you what they are finding out about how loneliness affects us. So the first thing is that loneliness does affect our brain negatively. I watched some presentations by neurologists, neurobiologists, who did studies on loneliness and people in solitary confinement. And what they found is that once a person was alone for more than a month, it began to change the brain in very negative ways. And that was very significant to them. So loneliness does change our brain if it takes place over a prolonged period of time. Secondly, people who struggle with loneliness consistently are people they're finding who have impaired ability to concentrate for very long and have some memory loss that is greater than normal, and it does affect their cognitive abilities. And so it does have multiple effects on the brain. but it also affects us physically. It weakens our immune system. And it was interesting for me to learn that when we feel lonely for a prolonged period of time, our body feels like it's under attack. And so our body goes into a heightened state, but prolonged periods of that begin to wear out our immune system and weaken it. It also, and this I found very fascinating, when people are very lonely, they feel physically colder. I don't know if they're actually colder, but they feel physically colder. Prolonged loneliness increases our risk of cardiovascular disease. It also increases the likelihood of an early death. That was based on a study in 1988. And what they found out is that being lonely is just as dangerous as cigarette smoking as far as life expectancy risks. And then, and we're going to look at this one more detail later, being lonely has a great effect on our mental health. And that's why for many mental health professionals, this forced isolation, distancing that we're going through as a culture is very scary because of what we know the effects are on people with mental health issues. And it will make those a whole lot worse. And what they find is especially depression and anxiety. Both of those get worse. I found it also interesting to learn that they have categorized loneliness into different types of loneliness. And you can kind of keep track as I go through this as to which ones are true of you right now. So 5 different types of loneliness. Number 1, interpersonal. And that would mean that you've gone through the loss of a significant relationship in the last year. So somebody very close to you has died, or you've been in a relationship, a close relationship that has ended, broken up, divorce, separation, or just breakup. So that creates a feeling of loneliness when that significant person is no longer in your life. Secondly, social loneliness, and that is for people who feel on the fringes of a group. So you don't quite belong, you don't quite fit in. You're just on the edges, and so that creates a bit of a loneliness. Or the group has somehow, that you were part of, has for some reason now excluded you, so that you are no longer part of it, so that you are going through active rejection by a group that used to be your peers. That creates a deep sense of loneliness. The third one, cultural. And many of you will relate to this. So if you came from a foreign culture into Canada and you don't really understand the language or the culture, you dress differently, you have different customs, you don't quite fit in, you feel a sense of loneliness. In Canada, in where I live, Manitoba, we have Aboriginal people who are adopted by white families. And so they call themselves Mac apples, red on the outside, white on the inside. And what happens with that is they don't fit in the Aboriginal world, and they don't fit in the white man's world, and they don't seem to fit in anywhere, and there's a loneliness that goes with that. Fourth one, intellectual loneliness. This is when your thinking is out of sync with your peer group or your family. They don't agree with you, they don't understand how you think, they have a different set of beliefs and values, and so you just don't connect there, and that creates a sense of loneliness. And then finally, psychological loneliness, and this is the one connected to trauma. So if a person goes through a trauma, but when they reach out for help to family or friends, they don't get that help because the family either doesn't understand what they're going through, or they don't care, or they don't have the tools to help them. The person feels extremely alone in the middle of a trauma. So can you imagine that if you had all 5 of those types of loneliness, how intense that loneliness would feel. And for most of the people that I work with, they would probably have at least 2 or 3, some would have 4 and 5 of those types of loneliness. And so loneliness becomes a very painful reality in their life. Let me give you a couple misconceptions that people have about loneliness. Some people think that the more friends you have, the less lonely you will be. And that is not true. Most people that I work with, they have hundreds of very superficial friends, acquaintances, and they can be in the middle of the crowd as the life of the party and feel very lonely. So loneliness is not about how many superficial friends you have. What they're finding out is if people, we all need some superficial friends, but we need a couple of very close friends. Friends where we have a safe, deep connection, where we can be authentic and be accepted. We can share very personal stuff and not be judged. If we have a couple of those kind of people in our life, we will not feel lonely. So loneliness is not about having more friends. Secondly, married people don't experience loneliness. I found it scary and sad that research done shows that 60% of the lonely people in our culture are married. So that means that people who are feeling very lonely and think that if I only got married, then that would fix all my loneliness, they run and get married, but they still don't connect with themselves, and they don't know how to connect at a deep level in a marriage, so they're married, but they're still lonely. And there's a lot of people who are married who are deeply lonely. So marriage in and of itself will not fix your loneliness. Third misconception, introverts are lonelier than extroverts. Not true. Loneliness has nothing to do with your personality, whether you're shy or outgoing. Introverts do have some challenges in building friendships. Extroverts have other challenges in building meaningful friendships. But the personality does not determine your depth of loneliness. And then a fourth misconception, there is nothing good about loneliness. As I said at the beginning, loneliness is built into us as an alarm system that we need to form meaningful connections. And it is to motivate us to do that. But in the process of waiting for those connections, we can use times of loneliness for great advantage. They can turn into positive things. Greater self-awareness can come from times of loneliness. Greater spiritual connection and growth can come from times of loneliness. Loneliness does not have to be a bad thing. It can actually turn into a good thing. Now let me talk about loneliness in light of complex trauma. What I want you to understand up front is that complex trauma creates lonely people. Everybody coming out of complex trauma will struggle with loneliness. And that, to me, is one of the many tragedies that come out of complex trauma. So let me explain that. Again, when a child is growing up in complex trauma, they were abused, they were abandoned, they were neglected, they did not form secure attachments with the ones that they looked up to. So when they reached out for help, dad was too busy, mom had her own problems, or they didn't have the tools to help. And so the child didn't attach. And then they say, it must be because I'm the problem. And so because of that, they go, I don't even want to attach to myself because I'm a loser. And so they don't attach to themselves, they don't attach to others, and that leads to loneliness. But it also leads to the belief that anybody who gets to know me will not want to connect with me, therefore never let anybody close. So the whole nature of complex trauma is not only does it produce loneliness, but it sets up a system that prevents the cure for loneliness, true connection. Because I think that true connection will lead people to reject me like mom and dad have. This next thing with complex trauma is that when a person is facing problems and they're not able to connect to somebody stronger and wiser and who loves them, they feel all alone. They feel abandoned. They might be physically abandoned, but they will feel emotionally abandoned. And an emotionally abandoned person feels lonely, but they think, again, everybody who gets to know me will abandon me. Therefore, my loneliness can never be solved. I can never resolve it. This is going to have to then be something I medicate, something I somehow numb. That is the only solution because of abandonment. And so all of that centers on that shame thing that we talk about. That core belief that develops when a child is abandoned and abused and neglected, that it's my fault, it's because I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not valuable, and anybody who gets to know me will find that out. And so if you don't deal with shame, it will continue to feed loneliness and prevent you from seeking out or risking healthy attachments. And it'll keep you stuck in loneliness. And with that is the fear of being authentic, and that will continue to feed loneliness today. You can have lots of superficial relationships where you wear lots of masks, but they won't satisfy and they won't cure the loneliness. A couple other things that prevent people from getting over loneliness, from healing and connecting. Number one, in order to connect, I need to trust. And complex trauma takes trust and knocks it out of a person. And it says to that person, you can't trust anybody. And so, again, the very solution to loneliness, trust, complex trauma hinders. The next thing, complex trauma causes many children to end up feeling, I'm a pain to my parents, I'm a burden, I'm a nuisance. They probably would feel better off if I wasn't around because I'm just an extra load for them. And so, why should I risk getting connected to others? Because they'll probably find me a burden, and then maybe they'll find I'm too needy and they won't want a relationship with me. I don't know if I can risk it. And so complex trauma does not just create loneliness, it builds in a whole bunch of systems that prevents all the necessary pieces to the cure for loneliness. Next thing I want you to understand, and this is a huge one, again, we started by saying that loneliness was designed to be a pain that was a good thing, an emotional pain, because it pulled you towards seeking out healthy connection. What happens in complex trauma is that emotional pain at some point no longer pulls you in a healthy direction. It pulls you in an unhealthy direction. It pulls you negatively. So if you think of loneliness, it then creates this pull on us in our thinking, our thought life, in our emotional world, and in our actions. So it pulls us in a negative direction in our thinking, in other negative emotions, and then in our actions. And if we give into the pull in any of those three areas, our thoughts, emotions, or actions, they will make the loneliness worse. So then it becomes a vicious circle spiraling downward if we give in to the pull of loneliness from complex trauma. So what's the pull on the emotions for a person with loneliness? First thing I want you to understand is all the emotions are going to be painful and negative, and they're all going to progress gradually. So think of it this way. Let's say day one of social isolation, you got up in the morning and you said, fantastic, I'm not even getting out of my pajamas today. I'm not even combing my hair, plucking my chin hairs. I am not even putting on makeup. I'm sitting on the couch and I'm going to go on a Netflix binge. And you love your first day of isolation. Now, 14 days later, you get up and you go, do I got to just sit on the couch again today? This is so boring. This is so difficult. So what was pleasurable now is a burden. And that happens with loneliness. The longer you're in it, not doing the right things, the worse you're going to feel, the more negative emotions you're going to feel, and the more intense they're going to become. So we've already talked about the mental health stuff that goes on with that. Depression, anxiety, and often with the depression comes feelings of hopelessness. I don't know what to do to get out of this feeling. I feel helpless to improve my mental health situation. Or what's going to happen with my job? What's going to happen with my finances? Anxiety. Is somebody going to get sick? And then you feel trapped because you can't think your way out of it. You can't predict the future. You're forced to sit in this unknown, and it's very uncomfortable, and your mind begins to go off in all kinds of directions. And so you can't begin to feel like you're in this prison you can't get out of. And then your feelings of abandonment can be intensified because all alone feels like abandonment all over again. And so you can be triggering stuff from your childhood as you sit alone in isolation. And abandonment is one of the most painful emotions to have triggered. And it can be very scary for people. And then shame can get triggered again because your brain, like nobody wants me. It feels like nobody is connecting with me, so I feel shame. And then for many, it's very easy to slide back into self-pity, into the victim mentality, poor me. And that, if you take any one of those negative emotions and feed them and nurture them, you are going to get into an even worse headspace. But it also affects your thinking. And so the different ways that the brains are affected by loneliness, one is what they refer to as a spinning brain, the hamster wheel. When you have too much time to think, but you don't have anybody to process it with, your brain can't get past certain points, and it spins and spins and doesn't make progress. With that, they're finding that the longer you are in isolation and loneliness, the more distorted your thinking can become without you even realizing that it's becoming distorted. And you can begin to believe lies about yourself, about life, about people in that state. And then your thinking tends to become more negative, and for many, you begin jumping to worst case scenarios. And that is a very dangerous place for your brain to go. So again, if you give in and feed any of those mental patterns, it will make things worse, not better. I think it's important to be aware that loneliness triggers certain needs within us and creates intense longings. They're longings that are always there, but it's loneliness that intensifies them to almost to a palpable, felt type of thing. The longing to be loved can become so intense when you're all alone. The longing to be wanted and cherished and valued. The longing to connect, or, and this is the one that's the dangerous one, the longing to escape. Escape all of these painful emotions. Escape this difficult set of circumstances and this frustrating life. And so those can become super intense during times of loneliness. And then the actions. So 2 impulsive tendencies. Number 1, if the brain can't find a solution to the loneliness that's healthy, it will begin to look for flight. Impulsive actions to escape. Impulsive decisions just to medicate the feeling, to get out of the feeling for a while. And that can be very dangerous because some of those impulsive decisions can be very self-destructive. They might give some short-term relief, but they will give negative long-term consequences. The second impulsive decision that will be there will be, I just need to connect. And for some people that is, I just need to hook up with somebody. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they're healthy or not. I just need somebody that's easy because I need to hook up. And that becomes their way of escaping the loneliness, often with terrible consequences. So be aware of the tendency for impulsive, rash decisions that are just getting out of the feeling decisions that have terrible consequences. Then there will be a tendency or a pull towards finding pseudo connections. So let's flirt with somebody online. Let's watch some porn. Let's connect with some people in a barroom type situation. And that just makes me feel good, even though I'm feeding some unhealthy desires inside of myself. Some people, instead of connecting in healthy ways, they respond to their loneliness by isolating even further. And that just makes it a whole lot worse. Some begin sleeping all the time. What they're finding for some people who are lonely, they struggle with insomnia. They can't sleep, or they sleep a few hours and then they're wide awake. So it does disrupt the sleeping. Others, when they're all by themselves feeling lonely, they have emotional eating and they overeat or they're snacking all the time. So what I want you to see is this. When you are feeling lonely, you're not feeling connected. And when you're not feeling connected, you are very vulnerable to addiction. Because addiction is all about false feelings of connection. So that's why loneliness is such a relapse trigger for people in recovery, because it triggers that false desire, or that desire for false connection. One other thing that you need to be aware of with loneliness is that if you begin to sit in it for too long, you will become less motivated each day to do the right things. And so it's not something you can play with for long before you get so unmotivated. You can know all that you should do, you just don't bother doing it because you've lost all motivation. So what are some tools that will help us in dealing with this loneliness? I think it's important just to restate one of the things that we've pointed out right from the foundation of Finding Freedom and React and the understanding of complex trauma. I want to take you back to the rat park experiment done by Dr. Bruce Alexander, where they took the family of mice and they introduced them to a cage where they had all these different levers where they could push, and they had water, pellet of food, toy, and then different drugs. And then they took one of those rats and isolated it. They created loneliness. They created complex trauma in that rat. After they had been in the happy family and the isolated rat for a period of time, they opened the doors of the cages towards the cage that had all the levers. The one from the happy family, it went and tried all the different levers, and it tried the drugs and all of that, but then it went back to its family, because what it knew was the satisfaction and joy from connection is much more pleasurable than that from drugs. Whereas the rat who had been isolated, it went in, and once it found the lever to either cocaine or meth, it pushed that lever till it died. And what we know is connection is so vital for health. And if we don't have it, we're vulnerable to addiction in a big way. So let me say this. Use this time to connect. It's an important distinction, I think. A lot of people in our culture use technology to avoid connection. They just want to play their games. They don't want to have people. But think differently of technology as something that can right now promote connection and use it. Now, there's another study that was done. They had people connecting via text messaging and email, and then they had people connecting via phone calls and FaceTime, video chatting. And what they found was the people who heard a voice or saw a face, it released chemicals in the brain that created a sense of wellness that weren't created in people who just texted and didn't hear a voice or see a face. So use technology as a way to reach out and connect with others. But secondly, connect with yourself. Use this time to journal and get in touch with yourself, to take an inventory of your emotions, of your spiritual life, to write about events in your life, your dreams, your goals. Do different things that would let you connect with yourself. Some people even take themselves for a date. Do that kind of thing, and you will benefit from doing that. Because complex trauma is not just about not connecting with others, it's about not connecting with self. So this time can be used to bring healing at the very core of your being. And then connect spiritually. Use this time to connect with your higher power. And I would say for most people who do this, they find this to be one of the greatest comforts and supports during this time of loneliness. And it's also one of the great ways of growing and healing their own personal self. Next thing, break up your day. Get off the couch regularly. Don't let yourself slide into a rut that is not healthy, that becomes lazy and hard to break. And the longer you're in it, the less motivated you get to get out of that rut. So choose to do little activities throughout the day that break up your activities so that you're not getting into a rut. And then I would encourage you to use this time to do a project of some kind, something that you've wanted to do, something that you could explore, something that's been on your to-do list for a long time. Now is a great time to do it. So, out of all of those things, the greatest and most important thing that I want you to hear is connect. And what I want you to also hear with that, if you come from complex trauma, is you may not have many connections right now in your life. So for you to connect means you're going to have to take a risk and reach out to somebody. Reach out to somebody that you know might be safe because you've been watching them a little bit. Reach out cautiously, carefully, but take the risk of taking that first step. It'll be scary. You'll have to confront your fears, but if you do so, I think you'll be glad that you did. Study over the last couple months on what I think is the best illustration in the Bible of complex trauma. And it was Israel when they were slaves in Egypt and were told for 4 generations. And so we've been watching Israel as they've come out of slavery. They were delivered by God with Moses as the leader. They were taken out. God promised them a promised land, which is the present-day Israel. And as we watch them come out of slavery, we see the characteristics of people with complex trauma or complex PTSD. And so what we begin to realize is that part of the journey across the wilderness towards the promised land was God giving therapy to Israel to help them heal from their complex trauma. And as we watch the different events that took place and the order in which they take place, we see this ingenious therapy plan by God to help people with complex trauma heal. And it's been a beautiful thing to watch. So up till now, we've done the first year where they came out of Egypt. They've traveled to Mount Sinai where God stopped for a while. There they received the 10 Commandments. There God created what was called the tabernacle. That was the place where they went to worship, where God came and met with them. It was their religious church. So God created a community that had healthy laws, healthy behavior, that had a healthy spiritual life, and he gave them all of that. And he expressed his love to them in many ways. He showed his commitment to them, his faithfulness to them, to deliver them from enemies, to provide food and water and guidance. All of these things God did in that first year. And now in the second year, we're leaving Mount Sinai. And so we're going to pick up tonight as they leave Mount Sinai and head towards Israel. And so in Numbers 11, this is what we read. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt, and the people of Israel also began to complain. "Oh, for some meat," they exclaimed. "We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna." Now, what I want to point out at this point here is as we follow Israel over the next year, this is going to be their pattern. They are going to go through some hardship, which will result in them complaining, and then God will meet their need. They will be thankful that their need was met, but they still don't trust God. They don't have a deep relationship with God, and so the next hardship they face, they start complaining again. And it's always like that. So what is it that triggers this pattern in them? And we are told that it was hardship. They complained about their hardships. So I just gave some thought to what would it be like to be an Israelite who for the past year has been living in a tent in the desert with 2 to 3 million people. That would be hard. And there would be some days you would feel that hardness, that hardship, more than others. Imagine you're going to have some days out in the desert where it was hot, super hot. And then you didn't just have yourself to get food for. That was hard. You had manna, but you had some livestock. And so you had to take them to find a bit of grass in a desert. And that at times would be very burdensome and frustrating. And then there's a lot of things you had to do without. You didn't have some of the things you had from your former life. And then you couldn't get away from people. You were always surrounded by people, little privacy. And even with your own family, you had a tent. And tents aren't big square footage type of places with a lot of room. And so there was a one-room house that you lived in with everybody. And you could hear the neighbors and all the neighbors, and that at times would have become very, very frustrating. Maybe that sounds a little bit like some of you are going through this past couple weeks, cooped up in your house with your kids, where you can't get a break, where you can't get alone to get a thought together. That can feel so hard if it continues for very long. And that's what was going on. And so a hardship is any danger, any difficulty, frustration, anytime your needs are not being met. It feels like a hardship. And it's a trigger for people from complex trauma. And what happens when people from complex trauma get triggered? We're told they crave. You know what? In recovery, if you are in addiction recovery, the word craving is a very common word that is used. And I will hear people talk about all the time, I haven't had a craving for this long. Or I just had a craving after not having one for a long time, and it was so hard. And for some people, their craving turns into an obsession. And that is a dangerous time for them. And so hardships trigger cravings for people with addiction and complex trauma. Now let me explain that, give you the logic of how that works. So, when you grow up in danger, where you're always on guard, where you're always aware that you could get hurt, you constantly have to be alert to difficulty. You're checking all the time. But you're focusing your brain on making sure you see the negative things. And so what can happen without realizing it in complex trauma is you begin to focus more on negative than positive, because noticing negative is what keeps you safe. But then without realizing it, you can become more negative and you become more discontent. And that can cause many people or most people from complex trauma to misdiagnose their discontent. They think, like the children of Israel, the reason I am feeling this way is because of my circumstances. And so what did the people of Israel say? The reason I am feeling and complaining like I am is because of lack of food. My circumstances. We're not getting enough meat. And so you begin to think that the problem is out there, not in here, which is a misdiagnosis. But it is very logical to somebody who's grown up in unsafe circumstances. Then once the brain feels discontent, it begins to explore options to try and solve the problem of discontent, to find a solution to their emptiness and to find some happiness. And if a person hasn't been taught or given a role model of healthy, their brain will go back to old behaviors that either gave escape or numb or instant gratification, even though it had negative long-term consequences. And so that's what happened to the people of Israel. They were in hardship, then it got triggered their craving, and they fed the craving, and it grew, and it grew, and it became an obsession. And that is the danger for people living like they are right now in forced isolation, is that they begin to experience hardship, which triggers a craving. And the brain says, I just need this out here instead of I need to look in here. And that misdiagnosis can kill you. But then I want you to see that it distorted their perception of their life. So it caused them to focus not on what they had, but on what they didn't have. So they didn't say, oh, I still have my children and my spouse. I still have a community of people who care. They say, we don't have meat. And that is what they began to focus on. And so pretty soon, by focusing on that one negative thing that they didn't have, it caused them to begin to see all of their life as negative. It bled over into everything. And then they magnified that negative thing to the point where they went from, we don't just not have meat, it's now we have a terrible life. This is the worst possible life one could have. And not having meat is a terrible tragedy. So they were catastrophizing the lack of meat. Now there's another thing that got distorted. It caused them to forget all of the important events that had happened in the last year. How God had delivered them from slavery, which had looked impossible. How God had provided food for them in a desert. How God had protected them from enemies. All of that they had forgotten. They forgot God's promise that he was going to take them to the promised land, and nothing could stop them. They forgot all of that. And then they got a distorted view of their past. They were slaves. But do you notice now, they're not looking at their slavery as a bad thing? They're not talking about the abuse they got or the people that were close to them that were killed by slave masters or the beatings that they saw their children take. They're not thinking of all that terrible stuff that caused them to cry out to God for deliverance. They're saying, we used to have onions and garlic and cucumbers and fish for free. And they're just focusing on a couple of the good things. So we call that selective memory. And when something is triggered by hardship, the brain easily slides into selective memory. Because what it says is, what's happening right now, this hardship, I have a terrible life. But the life I used to have, wow, that had some really neat things. And if you go into that distortion, it's not long till you're going to say, let's go back to Egypt, which is exactly what they ended up saying. And that's what many people do in recovery, where they say, let's go relapse, because of that selective memory. Now, there's another thing that they became very vulnerable to at this time of being triggered. We're told that they listened to the foreign rabble. Now, we're not 100% sure what foreign rabble refers to. Most think it refers to some of the Egyptian people who asked if they could leave Egypt with them. They were either dissatisfied with Pharaoh, or they were fascinated by Israel's God, and they wanted to be part of the Israel community. And so they traveled with them. But now the hardships and the deprivation of this journey has caused this foreign rabble to be triggered as well and to miss Mother Egypt. And they want to go back. What I want you to understand is this. When you're triggered and your thinking gets distorted and you begin to see just now as totally awful and you get selective memory about the past, you become vulnerable to listen to negative, grumbling people. And that's what Israel did. They started listening to this foreign rabble. And that could be an ex for you. It could be family members. It could be old using buddies, old friends. And all of a sudden, they say, come on, hang out with us again. And it just feels like a good idea when you're in such a bad place. And before you know it, you're in a terrible place. Now, there's two other things I want you to be aware of that were happening in this time of being triggered as they fed that trigger and it became an obsession, not just a craving. They began to question their authority. They began to develop negative opinions of the authorities. They saw the authorities as the ones who had brought them to this negative place. They blamed the authorities for not caring about them, for not loving them. And so they fed that, and that began to make it easier for them to walk away from those authorities. But more than that, they began to have their view of God change. Instead of this wonderful God who had delivered them, met their needs, provided for them in amazing ways, they now thought God didn't care and God couldn't be trusted. And so they were becoming negative about all the significant, positive people in their life, and they were being attracted to the negative foreign rabble. And that was a disastrous thing. I think you can see that when people get to a point of craving, if they feed it for very long, it develops into this consuming obsession. And once they get to that, they can't get out of it. They are too far gone, and they will relapse. And so if you find yourself craving, please don't feed it. Please reach out for help, because to stay there is going to begin to set off all these internal mental distortions that could be disastrous for you. Now, here's what I want to end with. And it's an important observation about God. God didn't stop them. God didn't say, I'm going to somehow prevent you from destroying yourself. He let them give in to their cravings, and then he provided meat, and they gorged themselves on it, and it led to some dying. And what God wanted them to see was, if you give in to these cravings for stuff that isn't your true need, it will destroy you. Your true need wasn't meat. That was not the solution to your discontent. What the discontent was coming from was from not connecting with me, not trusting me, not running to me. And so I think it's a wonderful example where God will not stop us from destroying ourselves, but he does that so that we hopefully will learn from it and realize the answer is not in doing that, but running to God. But if you haven't got to that point yet, please don't go there. Please run to God now. Don't give in to the craving. Trust him, run to him, and find in him again that connection and contentment